quadrants that are diagonal from each other are where your compositional relationships want to take place. So you're looking for what visual elements in the upper left quadrant relate to the visual elements in the lower right quadrant. Hey everyone, I'm Marianne Mitchell. Welcome to Whole Artist Mastery. Today I'm talking composition. Composition is something that we all in some ways struggle with and in other ways really know how to work with. There are many different approaches to learning composition, understanding composition, and using composition. So what do I mean by that? To me, composition is the use of visual language. So that's line, color, shape, value, and texture. And so the way we put those 5 elements together is what comes to be our composition. So I'm going to talk with you about how I've come to employ composition and how I think about it, because it's a little different than your classic academic approach to composition. And it's really grown out of my understanding of what my intention is for a painting, which is really related to understanding what your core expression is. So I speak about that in a recent video where I talk about what authenticity means and how you talk about authenticity without it sounding cliche. So how does one talk about composition without having your eyes glaze over or without feeling like, oh my gosh, I've never really understood composition? So I'm hoping that this approach to composition will open the doors so that you can employ it in a way that makes sense to you. So before I start with my discussion about composition, I invite you to go to the Whole Artist Mastery website and put your email in and get the free introductory guide to the Whole Artist Mastery philosophy and approach to making artwork, which has an outline in it of the compositional checkpoints that I'm going to be talking about. So you can follow along while you're looking at the compositional checkpoints as I talk about the compositional checkpoints. So this is a painting that I'm currently working on, and I would say that I'm knee-deep in what I call phase 3, which is integration, which is also part of the composition, or also part of the introductory guide, where you'll see the 4 phases I talk about described in very clear way so that you understand how all the 4 phases come together. So the 3rd phase is what I call integration, where I'm integrating my compositional decisions with the meaning or the feeling I have or that's developing or that I have for the painting. So I'm going to go through, there's 6 compositional checkpoints, and this is a good time to check in looking at your work with the compositional checkpoints. And the other time that's most useful is at the end when you think that you're finished with a painting and you're not quite sure if it's working. And so you employ these compositional checkpoints to see if your composition's working. Because a painting is going to be most successful in having viewers really connect to it if the composition is strong, the emotional and intellectual meaning is conveyed through color and mark, through the physicality of your paint application. So compositional checkpoint number 1 is what I call the quadrant check. So this works for any size painting, square, rectangular, vertical, horizontal. You divide the composition into 4 parts. So this is the upper left quadrant, lower right quadrant, upper right quadrant, lower left quadrant. Now I'm doing it in that way because the quadrants that are diagonal from each other are where your compositional relationships want to take place. So you're looking for what visual elements in the upper left quadrant relate to the visual elements in the lower right quadrant. Upper right quadrant visual elements relating to the lower left. If the relationships are top to bottom or left to right, your eye is unable to move around the whole composition. If they're diagonal, it requires your eye to move around and it invites you to have a relationship with the whole painting. So what do I mean by relationships with visual elements? So we're looking for color relationships, texture relationships, value relationships, line relationships, and shape relationships. Now, they don't all have to exist in quadrant to quadrant or diagonal quadrant relationships. So you look for what does exist, if anything exists, and if nothing is in relationship with each other, then your composition needs to develop more. So let's look at the upper left and the lower right, and what I see is some texture relationship here is talking to this to some degree, not entirely. By the way, the relationships are quadrant to quadrant, not necessarily corner to corner, although it can be. So something like this color here is slightly below the midpoint, and this color here is slightly above the midpoint. They're very similar colors, so they're talking to each other. What else do I have here? I have a very light value here, which is the opposite value of the very dark value here. So there can be opposite relationships. We have some orange reflective color here and some blue color here. So they're talking to each other as complementary colors. Let's look in this direction here. I have a little bit of darker color here, which is talking to the darker gray up here. And let's see, what else do I have? I have some texture in here, which is talking to the texture right here. That's similar. But what I am noticing is that the quadrant relationships have yet to really congeal. They have yet to really become solidified. And so that tells me that I need to put some more relationships in here to allow your eye to move around. So that brings me to the next checkpoint, which is the doorstop checkpoint. The doorstop checkpoint is when you're looking around the whole composition and there's one area where your eye, where your eye gets stopped and you're unable to move away from that. Your eye just keeps going to that area. I call that a doorstop because it means that it's holding your eye in that area without letting you get out of that area. So let's see. This could be considered a doorstop. And the reason I say it could be is because this blue down here does pull your eye away. It may not be strong enough, however. For me, A doorstop in this piece is this straight line across here. This allows me to just keep going back and forth, and it keeps me from moving all the way around. So for me, that's the doorstop in this painting. I invite you to take a look at it and see what you think. The next checkpoint I'm going to talk about is the division checkpoint. What does that mean? So what I do is I divide a composition visually down the vertical center. And then I cover up one side and look at the other side as though it's a composition unto itself. Then you switch and you look at the first side as a composition unto itself. And if each side is equally engaging for different reasons, then they're talking to each other, they're in play with each other. If one side keeps you there longer than the other side, it's more interesting to look at than the other side, then the other side is where you need to go next to make it be more in relationship to the side that's more compelling. So let's do that here. So hold your hand up and cover, let's say, the right side of the painting, and look at the left side here. Now switch. Cover up the left side and look at the right side. Is one more interesting than the other for you? Now, the quiet side isn't always the less interesting side. Sometimes it's the most interesting side because the other side has way too much going on. So I think that the left side here is more quiet and the right side has a little bit more going on, both in terms of strong color. But I do find myself more engaged on this side than on the left side, which tells me that maybe a little bit more has to come in here to bring them in play with each other. That doesn't mean I have to bring bright color here or more shapes, but it does mean that maybe I need to accentuate something just a little bit more. Now, here's a little aside. As Westerners, we are taught to read from left to right and top to bottom, which is how we visually read a composition. So if we enter the composition from the upper left quadrant, because we read from top to bottom and left to right. So on the left side, if there's something here that keeps you from moving across, then you need to do something on the other side to pull you across. So in this direction, having the orange over here does pull you from the left side over to the right side. If we turn this around, we're now getting into what I call the rotation checkpoint. The rotation checkpoint is when you turn it upside down and you look at the composition in a 180-degree way. So it's totally upside down, and it allows you to see compositional problems that you're unable to see the other way, or it can confirm that the composition is actually working. So let's look at it this way and thinking about, again, reading from left to right. Do we get stuck on the left side with this orange? Either way, I'm beginning to feel like maybe this could be a potential doorstop. It could also be something that keeps your eye on this side of the painting, whether it's on the right or the left. The other thing I'm seeing upside down is how much darker this is than the light color up here. And that maybe I want to make this less light in value and make this area lighter in value so they talk to each other more. I hope that makes sense to you. The next checkpoint is the host and guest checkpoint. Now, I learned this when I was studying in China from Chinese landscape master painters. And they call this particular compositional approach the host and guest approach. And it works like this. It's basically dominant and subordinate elements working together. So they talk about the active area and the passive areas. We might call that the dominant and the subordinate. So, and they can be interchangeable. So you might say that this is the dominant area in this part of the composition with the solid gray color around it acting as the guest to the host. But then as you move up here to the orange, you could say that the orange is the host and this is the guest to the orange because it's stronger and more concentrated. And this is more misty and less concentrated, not as bright a color as the orange. And then we move up here and you could say that the blue-black area is the host and the gray is the guest. But then the gray also is the guest to the lighter value here. So it's a relationship that moves in interchangeably ways. That sounds like a weird sentence. They move back and forth. And I once heard Yo-Yo Ma talk about going to Minneapolis to play in a concert. Actually, it was St. Paul. And he, talked about he was the guest of the city of St. Paul, but when he got up on the stage, he became the host and the audience became the guest. And then when he got back down off the stage, he became the guest again and the audience moved back into being the hosts because they were from St. Paul. So when I heard him talk about this, I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly the same thing as this interchangeable relationship between host and guest in your compositions. The last checkpoint is what I call throw out all the checkpoints checkpoint. What does that mean? That means that you can go through all of these different checkpoints and they can all check off and say, yes, I've got all that working. But I don't feel anything when I look at the painting. It doesn't speak to me. So the way you work with this checkpoint is you ask yourself, am I compelled by this painting? Could I look at it for a really long time? And every time I look at it, do I see something different? Do I always get a thrill in some way every time I walk by the painting and say, oh, I just love this painting? And sometimes the answer to that question takes time because it takes time to know whether it's really truly there. I call that the marination phase. And so the throw out all the checkpoints checkpoint in some ways is the most important. But the way you get there is by employing the previous checkpoints to make the composition work so that the last checkpoint, which is checking in with yourself to see if it makes you think, makes you feel, and you appreciate the paint application and the way the painting has come together in its physical manifestation. If all of that is completely integrated, then the painting is finished. It's reached its resolution. So I hope this discussion has been helpful for you And I invite you to go back over the compositional checkpoints that are outlined for you in the introductory guide. And put some questions down below in the comments below if you have them. If you have comments about how you choose to work with composition, I'd love to hear them. And let me know how this works for you. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.